Well, I think there's lots to teach kids, but also lots for them to teach us. Like, I gave a talk at the beginning of the month in Canada, and I used my son and some of our conversations as this framing tool to talk about the future related to like inclusion. And like at the end of the talk, I just realized like a lot of the stuff that I talked about, a lot of the concepts I talked about were things that like my son had told me. And so it was like really amazing. And it was like people really like connected to the fact that like, yeah, your son is like brought these concepts to you. Because one of the things I was saying is that like we were arguing because like my son was saying like, Portal's a real dad, and I was like, Portal's and I'm like, that's not a thing. He's like, no, they're real. And then I was having a separate conversation with somebody else, and I was like, oh yeah, Portal's totally real. So like, I went back to my son and I apologized, and I was like, you know what, JP, you're right. Like, Portal's real. And I just like, I really appreciated the fact that like so much of that talk was based on things my son had said to me, or things that he had shown me. And I was like, yeah, there's so much potential in that kind of experience. So, yeah, I'm really thinking, like, how does that sort of relate to the work that I do, and how does that kind of become an approach that I try to run? So that's a small, yeah, it's really, and I'm like super thankful for we work more with science. So we actually did a project with WWF in Sweden. Yeah, these are just conversations we're having. Homie's a big, like, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Sonic the Hedgehog fan, and so like, Spider-Man is a huge thing for him, and so it's like the things that he's engaging with in those cartoons we talk about, but they're totally relevant for like the work that I'm doing and the work that I'm trying to do and how I'm thinking about work. So it's like it's super interesting to kind of like think about how I'm thinking about it, and then think about how I'm thinking about it, and thinking about like even have those boundaries that I have. Like, one of the things they said in the car was like Spider-Man, when I do that, it's Peter Parker. And right now, Spider-Man is Peter Parker, it's Miles Morales, in the new movie they have Spider-Man T-Rex. And like for him, that's Peter Parker. So Spider-Man's all these people. And so like, he doesn't have those boundaries that I grew up with, like Spider-Man is Peter Parker.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session on Beyond Net Zero. My name is Ella Saltmarshe. I am the director of the Long Time Project and your host for this session. I am joined by a truly incredible panel up here. So let me introduce you to them, and then we are going to do a bit of time traveling before we dive in. So first of all, to my left, we have Julius Lindsay. Julius is Director of Sustainable Communities at the David Suzuki Foundation, and he leads the foundation's work on climate actions in cities. He's also a co-founder of the Black Environmentalist Alliance. Next to Julius, we have Andrew. Dr. Andrew Merrie is Head of Futures and Research Lead at Planethon, founder of Radical Ocean Futures and Vice Chair of the Swedish National Foresight Network. And then we have Alice Ruhweza. Alice is Senior Director, Policy Influence and Engagement, Asia, Africa, Asia Pacific, and Europe for WWF. Before we hear from our panelists, though, I am going to hand over to Andrew to take us somewhere.
So, if we're going to go beyond net zero, then we have to travel there briefly first. So, if you could all please close your eyes. We'd like to invite you to briefly to time travel with us into the future, into a world beyond net zero. Take a deep breath. You wake up in 2073 in Dubai. What do you smell? What is the first thing you see? What sounds do you hear? What do you have in your right hand? How do you feel about the world you see around you? Are you proud? Are you disappointed? Are you full of rage? Why? Waking up in a world beyond net zero, what has really changed? What from 2023 has been allowed to die with dignity? What do you look back on and see as absurd or ridiculous? What seeds of the future that existed in 2023 have germinated, bloomed, and flourished? What makes you uncomfortable in this world? And finally, how have love, power, and justice manifested themselves? Just think about those things for a few more seconds before we bring you back into the present. Oops, you accidentally pressed the red button and you've been slammed back in 2023.
Okay, I'm going to invite you to gently let your eyes blink open to have a smooth transition back to the present. And perhaps actually before we start, just to take a moment to feel in your body how that felt. How are you feeling? How did the Beyond Net Zero future feel for you? So, on the eve of COP, this is the conversation to be having. And as we dive into this topic, we are going to be exploring what Beyond Net Zero means. So I'm inviting each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their practice, the way they work with the future, but also to talk a bit about what Beyond Net Zero means to them. And so Julius, let's start with you.
Yeah, as Ella said, I'm Julius Lindsay, and I'm the Director of Sustainable Communities at the David Suzuki Foundation. And in terms of my practice, I've been working in climate change for almost 20 years now. And I feel like a lot of climate work, particularly over my career, has been futuring, like thinking about the future, thinking about the changes we need to make and how we get to those changes, what that looks like. And I spent almost 10 years in cities doing that work, doing public engagement and building plans at the city level to take climate action. And you know, in Canada at least, public engagement is a compliance exercise where city staff think that the public are basically mildly annoying and that we have to placate them every now and then. And so when I think about Beyond Net Zero and having worked in this space and thinking about it, I think about not only the time sort of after net zero, but thinking about sort of the concept of net zero and going beyond that. And so how are we sort of not only looking at our climate crisis, but other crises that are going on in our societies? How are we thinking about like who's center in that conversation around net zero? And you know, often that's science and scientists, and I think there's a lot of value from our communities. I'm obviously biased. I spent 10 years working at cities, and I'm biased that there's a lot of value in communities, and a lot of the solutions are there, particularly with marginalized communities. And I think that's another sort of beyond net zero, is that our current net zero conversation is focused on one that was created largely by those in power and largely by scientists. And I think that you know, there's a marginalized communities are the ones that are feeling the effects now, and they are the ones that have lots of ideas of how to solve it. And so I think about Beyond Net Zero not only from a time perspective, but also from a space perspective, and who's really centered in this conversation when we talk about the net zero conversation. And I think, you know, it's very apt that we're having this conversation in a futures forum, and I often make sure the S is at the end of that word of futures, because I feel like oftentimes when we talk about net zero, we're talking about a future that everybody will live in. And I think the context of what a net zero future looks like, you know, for me who lives in Toronto, Canada, and somebody who lives in China, and somebody who lives in Europe, and somebody who lives in Africa, and somebody who lives in Argentina, those will all be very different futures. And so I think we need to think about climate action in that context.
Thank you. So I think that my practice is informed by the fact that I'm spent half my time as a sustainability scientist and the other half of my time working as head of futures at Planethon. And a lot of that is about this kind of tension that during my PhD, which was this realization that there's so much science which is already saying a lot of things about the future, but it's often stuck in science, isn't being able to communicate outwards, and also many scientists struggle to even understand the kind of complexity which is at the core of their results. So when we have all of these multiple crises and multiple kinds of changes happening at once, what kind of tools can we use, and how can we leverage imagination and storytelling to help us kind of be able to grasp these multiplicity of futures? So I started using kind of science fiction storytelling, also using artwork, trying to engage with culture, creating more immersive experiences, not running away from emotion, and trying to bring all of that into how I kind of work with futures. And I mean, I also so that when I think about like what net zero means to me, I mean, the first thing I think to pick up on is like, I think it's also it's a very specific set of scientists who've also been privileged in those conversations and many other kind of science. I mean, it's only in the very last few years that social scientists have even played a big role in the IPCC. And that's not to mention then humanities scholars and others. So as we try to bring in more kinds of knowledge systems, it's about broadening what kind of ideas are involved in that conversation. But net zero, it's a term that has so much on its shoulders, but it actually means not very much at all, and especially if you look at it from the perspective of if it's just trying to do essentially a carbon balance on a scale, you might do that, but if you only do that, then you're going to be neglecting many, many other things, not least of which is all of the other integrated planetary boundaries, all of the other challenges. How do we ensure a fair and just transition? So net zero is meaningless if we don't make a whole bunch of other transformative changes at the same time. So when we're thinking about what does beyond net zero mean, it really depends on what has happened along that, because otherwise, even getting there is simply just fantasy.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's amazing. I think I'm following you. I mean, I think you make a very good point. So I'm wearing my badge today that says net positive, net zero nature positive. So net zero, first and foremost, from my work's perspective, basically is, with the way we think about it, is that between now and 2050 or 2070, that there will be more nature than there is now. So that's where the nature positive, right? We need to grow. And that there will be no more destruction of nature, even by 2030. So we push this net zero nature positive. But from my own personal perspective, I mean, I think about it from the continent where I live and when I look at the future. And really, I mean, for us, for Africa, the future is our youth. You know, this is the place where population is going to grow the most. And it's the place where even currently our population average is between 18 and 22, I think our biggest population. So I look at that net zero and as a place of hope, a place of innovation, a place where we can have the youth come in and start being in charge of resolving our problems, being at the forefront of designing what that future looks like. And so, I mean, there is the part about work and, you know, the destruction of nature and the more nature, but there's also the expanse of opportunity that is created by that fact that there's this demographic dividend that's going to be there, and it's an open space for them to really create what the future they want to look like. So, but we need to equip them, and we need to work with them, and do all the things that you're talking about. Thanks.
Before we go on to the next question, I'm going to go off script and actually just ask a couple of you, what does beyond net zero mean for you? Has anyone got anything they'd like to share about that? Don't be shy. Yes, great. Do we have a roaming mic? Can we shake one of the mics? So at the gentleman at the very back.
Thank you very much. I'm James. I'm from Sydney. And I think Beyond Net Zero is about, and this has been alluded to already, is about not just thinking of it as a technical goal, but as a social goal as well, and looking at the political economy and the political ecology of net zero. So the key word there is political, as in what does society think, in what way does it intertwine with society's values and judgments, in what way does it take people on the journey with them rather than oppose them and work against them. And that's sort of the principle of good political, or of political economy and political ecology more generally. And so I think we're moving beyond the traditional ways we've thought about net zero, if we can think about it that way as well.
Thank you, James. Over here.
So for me, Beyond Net Zero is about healing the harm that we've done to the planet, not just, again, meeting some specific technical goals. And in addition, actually, Beyond Net Zero for me is more about how do we have a harmonious existence so we innovate, we can still progress as humans on this planet, but we do it in harmony with nature, with the planet. And the final thought I had that when I was just thinking about this conference and Beyond Net Zero is that as I was walking around and all the construction going on, what if nature had a voice? Nature is missing from this. There's no one, as in what if we could use AI to understand what the birds, the plants, the oceans are telling us?
And one more, just in front of you, yeah. No, just here, yeah.
I think like in thinking about what he said, I'm also thinking about what we have to give up and how we prepare for that, because it sounds wonderful, but there's things we have to give up that are comfort, that are familiar. So how does that play into it, and how do we hold space for that?
Thank you. There was one more at the back, and then we will bring you in again.
Hello, thank you for this good panel. I'm a Canadian like Julius, so I care a lot about migration and immigration. So for me, post-COP and looking at generating, it's also about migration. How do we facilitate migration from diversified lands to countries who are beneficial subjects of climate change, like the one where I live? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, this is about our collective wisdom, so it is really great to hear from you all. We're going to dive into now this sense of storytelling. So, Andrew, it was something that you brought up. Often when people think about Beyond Net Zero, it can be about imagining a world where we have moved beyond net zero. And I'm curious to hear from each of the panelists whether you think this kind of climate nature positive storytelling, where we're telling positive visions of the future, is a useful tool or not in your work. And I might start with Alice this time.
Yeah, it is a useful tool. Let me give you an example. When we had COVID, when the COVID disruption came in, up until that time, and I'm talking about Africa mostly, up until that time, most of our funding from conservation came from tourism, and it was very lucrative because these resources would come in, and they would of course pay for conservation work in national parks, but then they would also go into treasury and pay for education and pay for health. And so it was really, I think, second to remittances. Most of these countries had nature-based tourism as the second highest foreign exchange earner. And then comes COVID. No one can travel. No one can, all the things basically disrupted everything we depended on. And so there were no more tourists coming. And we had to start thinking, we had to rethink our future of conservation, where we do not depend on funding from tourism, and think about that in 10 years, what are we going to do? And it was useful to have that exercise, because up until then we had not thought about it. Up until then we always counted on these kinds of resources, and then we started to really look at things like domestic tourism. How do you grow that so that you have people within that locale, that you really factor them into your thinking? How do you think about maybe creating that tourism experience that someone comes from abroad to see, but creating it in some kind of video? And some people did some of that. And they were starting looking at alternative financing sources for conservation that don't have to depend on that. So I think it forced us to think beyond the current to really look much closer. And of course, that was caused by a big disruption, but in many ways, I thought it helped. And I felt like that exercise also put people in that mindset and really forced them to think about solutions and to plan better for the future.
Thank you. Andrew.
So I'm honestly really, really torn on this. Some days I think that climate and nature positive storytelling can play a really important role. Other times I think there needs to be a lot more of kind of a mixed set of emotions in how we tell stories about the future. Because I think that, and I try to think about how we can use informed hope or calibrated hope in terms of how we tell stories and making sure that we do share solutions and things, but also to realize that whatever we're doing in the next 50 years and the stories we're telling about those futures, there will be winners, there will be losers, there needs to be shifts in power structures. It is going to be a very complex set of emotions. We already see young people now suffering from kind of climate anxiety and starting to kind of disengage. There's many people who are at the very kind of spare point of climate who don't have, who need kind of action now. So I think for me, it's about blending utopian and dystopian elements together and trying to find a balanced way to tell stories into the future. And I think that any positive storytelling has to be really nuanced. Otherwise, you risk it essentially being hopium. You take this drug of kind of hope and these positive futures, but there's actually not there behind them because you're not actually really engaging with what it will take to change things. So I've done kind of both stories that are more positive and those that are more not so positive, and I think it's the conversation between those where I find often the most value.
Great, Julius.
Yeah, building off of what Andrew said, I think I believe that positive storytelling is important, but I also think that positive storytelling, future storytelling, has to incorporate the realities of the past and also the realities of what it's going to take to get there. Because I think, speaking as a marginalized person who lives in Canada, oftentimes when we jump into hopeful futures, there's this erasure of like the reality of what it's like for me to live in Canada, and I am a very privileged person living in Canada, but I'm also an oppressed person living in Canada, and those two realities have to be held simultaneously, and those kind of stories need to be understood. We have, some of our Indigenous communities in Canada are living in third world conditions, so-called third world conditions, and we need to realize that as this transition happens, if we're going to be hopeful, we need to also hold the fact that people are struggling right now. And people are oppressed right now. And so I hold that hopeful storytelling is important and has a place in this work, but I also think that cannot be a placeholder for just being like, oh, we all need to be happy and we just need to erase the fact that people are struggling. And I think that hopeful storytelling has the ability to highlight the fact that those challenges are happening now and be focused on creating solutions for those challenges, not only from a climate perspective, but from all of the polycrises perspectives that we are looking at. And I think that's the way that we move forward. And so I think there is a way that the hopeful highlights the challenging or oppressive now.
Great. From what you were just saying, it made me think that when we have stories that are just purely positive, there can be a form of kind of inequality or injustice bypassing, that we bypass that in the present and then don't acknowledge how that might play out into the future. So this leads on to the next question, which is about who gets to shape the future. And so I'd love to hear from each of you in your work, like who gets to shape imaginaries and futures and how. And maybe Andrew, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, so I would say that this is a challenging question for me because in terms of me using science fiction prototyping, and I work with me and a small group of colleagues in shaping these, and it's always when you do that, it's always this question of whose voice can I represent? Should I even try? Should I, and so that becomes like a tension, and I'm not sure always kind of get that right. But in that sense, it's like trying to keep the imaginaries open, so not trying to claim that they're a truth, but one of many different kinds of alternate futures, and that we are trying to explore, and that the purpose of those is to engage more people in the conversations, to realize like when you're developing scenarios that those should be the starting point of the conversation, not the end point, and then there's always opportunities then to engage people further, I think, in the process. And I mean, one thing I think that has been really encouraging in the future space from an academic perspective is I think that there is some really, really exciting new projects that have launched which have much more diverse voices involved in creating futures, from indigenous futures to both Afrofuturism and African futurism and many more. And some of those projects have been sort of connected to the research we're doing. So to say that part of it is also like, if you can't bring it into your own process, you need to make sure that you're still open and very kind of free in how ideas are shared, and make sure that those people who actually have their future at stake are shaping those futures and you're not doing it for them. So that's how I would say that I'm constantly trying to reflect and balance how I kind of engage in this space.
Thank you. Alice?
I can't think of any other group that could shape the future than the youth, you know. Think about it. I mean, they're the ones that get to live in that future. And I think we've seen very much, especially on the climate side, you know, Fridays for the Future. We've seen really the youth get out there and really put a very strong voice behind climate. And I think their big arguments have exactly been that. We are the ones that are going to be affected, and we feel like you're not doing enough, and we want to take control and do more. So for me, absolutely, the youth we should have spaces for them to work to think about it, to work together, to be part of the solution, to co-create solutions. And I'm really excited that I see a lot of that happening now, and I think we need to continue to do that. Thanks.
Yeah, for me, I got attracted to futures work because of, as I said before, sort of the compliance exercise nature of public engagement in cities. And you know, there's often that question of like, who's not there, who's not at the table, and it was very easy to see who was not at the table. And so for me, in the organizations that I've helped create or that I've helped run, it's always about like who's most affected. Those are the folks that should be most consulted and have the most say in the decisions that are being made. And so, you know, in Canada and in many places in the world from a climate change perspective, those are marginalized communities. Those are oppressed communities. Those are the people at the fringes that we often don't take the time to hear from. And so in my sort of futures work now and related to climate change, like those are the people that I'm focused on. Those are the folks that I'm focused on, and particularly like connecting with my community, because I think there is a disconnect, particularly in Canada in the climate space. There's often this idea that if you're not engaging, that means you don't care and you don't understand. And many of these people do care and do understand, but they've never been engaged in a way that they can engage. The conversation starts from me, the person who's trying to engage people, of like, oh, you need to reduce GHGs. Like, I could go to my mom and say, you need to reduce GHGs, and she would not be able to engage that conversation. But if I sat down talked with her about literally hundreds of plants that she has in her household, and the 3 community garden plots that she runs, and we talk about the changing of the weather, and we talk about you know, the effect on her plants, we could have a very nuanced conversation that she would care about. But I'm starting from where she is at. I'm not starting from you need to reduce your GHGs and you need to stop burning fossil fuels. And I think so often, at least in Canada where I'm from, this conversation starts from we need to reduce GHGs and we need to stop oil and all these conversations, when the conversation could start from places where people understand, people care about, and where they can enter the conversation. In one of the cities that I was doing a climate change plan for, we had a stakeholder panel, so we had people from our utilities and from other levels of government and all these folks there, and we had some of our community groups there. And one of the folks from the community group came up to me and said, Julius, you know, why am I here? You have the person from the utility, you have the person from our natural gas utility, you have the person from the university, like, what am I gonna contribute? And I was like, well, all of those folks have technical expertise. You have expertise of living in this location for more than 40 years. And that is very crucial information for how we do a climate change plan. And that person never asked me again while they were there and engaged fully, because they knew they had something important to contribute. But it was about that, and this is a person who works in the climate change space, is about them understanding why they were there and what they're contributing, not me telling them like what I need out of them.
And just following on from that, so you described how you talk to your mum and talking to individuals about this. How do you do that kind of work with groups or in a more collective way?
For me, I think that's why I was attracted to the future space, because I think there are just so many techniques and opportunities to have collective knowledge, to have conversations. I think part of that work is, as I said, sort of going to where people are and starting from their point of view. And oftentimes that is centering community, oftentimes that is embedding yourself in the community. I was having a conversation with my wife earlier, and every time I do a panel like this, somebody asks, well, you know, I'm doing this work and I'm really struggling to understand these communities. It's like, why don't you just go to the community, give them the money, let them do it? And so, you know, it's not centering me, it's centering them, and it's facilitating them to be able to do that work. And so, you know, that's how I feel like you get groups together, because those groups, you know, they trust each other, they have a greater understanding, they have more knowledge about their context, and that's how you get really rich information, really interesting solutions out of it, because, you know, you're centering them, they are in a place of comfort, they understand the context, they know, they're engaging in a way that they would engage, and it's really important, I think, you know, in futures work, in community engaged work, to decenter yourself and center the folks that you're working with. And so I think that's really important for how people work together.
Amazing. So it's time now for you to ask questions of our panelists. I have more for them, but it would be great to hear from you. So if you just raise your hand and a mic will be delivered.
Thank you very much. Very fascinating discussion. So for net zero, of course, we know the game plan, we understand the science. You know, the analytical mind works very rationally, and we are able to put numbers to context, and we are able to take decisions. In future, beyond net zero, is there right now ambiguity? We don't have much clarity? Are we still trying to figure out what we have to do as a planet? So the conversations which I'm observing and listening to, my analytical mind stopped working. You know. So thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask for a point of clarification there? So what's your question? Is it that there is ambiguity around what beyond net zero world?
And how do we address that?
Okay, great. We'll take a few questions and then we'll come back.
Yep. Hi, I have kind of an add-on to that question, you know, maybe playfully or seriously. Do you have any alternate imaginaries on what beyond net zero could mean? For instance, you know, could it be that beyond as in you shove it to one side and just bury it in the discourse? I doubt it, you know. Or could it be, you know, something like the opening panel, space travel, you know, where you go beyond this issue, you know. So, yeah, do you have any alternate imaginaries beyond net zero?
Great, thank you. We'll take those two and then we'll come back for more. So who would like to dive in first? Pick your question or questions.
Thanks for those. Always appreciate the challenging questions. So I think I would answer the ambiguity question from a complex systems perspective, which, as we know, there's a lot of nonlinear change in the current system. There's a whole bunch of tipping points in the Earth system, and we also know that there's feedback loops. So when we take action and we put interventions into the system, it has kind of feedback loops, it has cascading effects, and it has different kinds of things. So I think that it's really about going to be a process of kind of navigating through rapids rather than analytically steering ourselves, because as we continue to change the pressures we put on the system, when we try to change the political economy, when we try to change social institutions, when we try to seek justice, all of those things are going to shift the kind of dynamics of the system, and that is going to then pop up new kinds of ambiguities in the future. And I don't think that's something to be afraid of, but I think it is something to really take seriously, that you can't, the more you try to kind of understand and the more, and yes, we are gaining an immense amount of kind of knowledge and lots of different tools that we can apply in an analytical sense, but it's about combining that kind of analytical with a systems understanding and also not forgetting the more creative tools that we have at our disposal for being comfortable in that tension and ambiguity. I'll let someone else answer.
I think Alice is going to jump in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And it's not only is it there's ambiguity, but it's also hard to force yourself to think past the current circumstances, which is what normally happens, isn't it? I remember when we were talking about this subject, I was talking about that. What if I don't want to think beyond this year because there's just already so much going on? But I think, of course, it's extremely important. I was reading this morning, more than by 2070, which is the year we are looking at the moment, more than 3 billion people will be living in places with near unlivable temperatures, as you keep hearing about in climate change, and of course, very, very, very scary. But then there's also some hope where, there's solutions like some of the forgotten food crops, that's what we call them, that are suitable for those kinds of climate conditions. And if we start looking at them now, we could support those people who will be living in that unlivable temperatures. I think I agree that there's no linear way to say that this is what it's going to look like. And I think you have to go through those process of thinking about, of doing that scenarios. In fact, I think that's the net scenario planning is what it's about, right? You do play out all the 5 different scenarios that it could look like and play out what you could do. Thanks.
I think I would just add and push back on the starting of your question, which was that we know the playbook. I would actually disagree with that. I don't think we actually do know the playbook, because I think there's lots of areas that the playbook that we have now does not work. And so that's where, to your question of beyond net zero, that's where I think of and where I started in terms of beyond net zero, because I think that analytical playbook, I'll bring it back to myself. That analytical playbook does not work for my family that lives in the country of Grenada. And so, I think we have this idea that that's going to work everywhere and that there is this one future. And I think we need to go beyond that into many futures. And so I think part of this, part of the ambiguity to your question is how do we think about this solution as multiple solutions in multiple locations throughout the world? And so, I often, this is sort of where my work starts, is that questioning of that idea that we know what we need to do and we just need to get on with it, because how many people have we not included in that conversation of what we need to do? And so I think that's a really important part of the work that we still need to do to be able to get to where we need to go.
Great. Next round of questions. There was one at the front.
So I wonder if we keep speaking of fairness and justice, if there is a danger in not including more voices. So I'm thinking also as we need to hear more scientists, right? Not only that we need to hear social scientists or humanities scholars and all of that. It makes me wonder, is there any space to move beyond this ethics that focus on justice and rationality in a way? So we can include care or empathy. So how do we create narratives that, and I almost want to use the big F word and say feminism in a way, right? But is there an alternative way of making us think of rationality so it is more inclusive?
Okay, one more question and then we'll take it back. Great, the gentleman here.
Thank you very much. I'd like to put the panelists on the spot by asking them, net zero is now universal discourse. At this point, everywhere, it's agreed. COP28 is knocking on the door from 30th. Other discussions, other commitments. So mine is to bring us a bit to the background, which is always political. At the end of the day, all these things we discuss are going to be done by political players and depend on a lot of their goodwill and their incentive to do it. So we've talked for a long time about even net zero and even just basic commitments, like for instance, and now coming from Africa, I think, $100 billion commitment that was made in Copenhagen. It's part of what was featuring. Nairobi hosted the Africa Climate Summit, and it's part of what sort of like pressing on for that commitment to be upheld. And now the loss and damage facility that came up in COP27. So there's plenty of commitments and discussions and commitments. But if I look on the one hand, I find that we still have not had anything from the US in terms of reducing the strategic petroleum reserves. All the conflicts that are happening still are energy-based and have a lot to do with the fossil fuels. So on the one hand, we're talking very big about net zero, but on the other hand, we are yet to make any serious commitments. We were not talking to Venezuela until the oil production threat from OPEC came up, and now the US is in good books with Venezuela because of the oil. So all that is something that I feel sometimes we lose sight of in this discourse, because at the end of the day, that political goodwill is very critical, and political goodwill is based on power. And therefore the question is, since it's based on power and energy is also a big part of driving power, who is going to blink first? Who is going to drain their strategic petroleum reserves first in light of us achieving net zero? So it's really an open-ended question. Thank you.
Thank you. So, speakers, two big questions.
I'll give a very quick one, because I agree with you that, I mean, politics, policy is politics. There is no space in this world where politics doesn't get to play. And geopolitics in climate change is important. And yes, that's why the first 2 days of the COP, the World Ambition Summit, which will bring, probably heads of state. Because there is no way we can effect change if we do not have the political will of our leaders. And so leadership is a big point here. And leadership will have to take into consideration our own sovereign states issues and our regions. So it's inevitable. It's absolutely inevitable. But I think it underscores that the future that we want to design means that we need to have everybody at the table. So we cannot sit here as scientists on our own to design a future unless we also bring the politicians at the table, and we bring the youth, and we bring the the people. So for me, it's about, again, we need everybody to be at the table in order for us to design this future, because if we have a small group thinking about it, then it will obviously go there and be trampled down by the politics. So we need the politicians in the room. Thanks.
I would just add for the first question, I was thinking about, so there's an area in Toronto that is very marginalized. They have high crime rates among youth. And so I was watching a webinar one day, and there was a director from our federal government who had gone into that neighborhood and had a conversation with youth who were living in that neighborhood. And he said that was the most nuanced analysis of the issues that were going on in that community that he had ever had. And this was 15 to 19-year-olds who he's having this conversation with. And so when we talk about justice and we talk about, and your question about rationality, I think part of the solution to that is going beyond sort of who we think of as a scientist, who we think of as a policymaker, who we think of as the people who are making these decisions, because these 17 to 19-year-olds were doing nuanced analysis that a director walked away thinking, this is the most nuanced analysis I've ever heard of, and these are teenagers who we're having this conversation with, and those are not usually the people we think of when we think of nuanced analysis from. And so I think part of this, and that to me is justice, because that conversation was youth coming to the policymakers saying, these are the solutions we need in our neighborhood. And that was a federal government official saying, this is the analysis I need to help solve these solutions. And that to me is justice. And so, when we think about, I will admit I was annoyed by one of the presentations this morning, because when we think about the people who are included in this conversation, when we think about the people who are going to be providing these answers, they are not who we are traditionally going to think of as a scientist, as a policymaker, as a leader. And so going beyond those definitions is going to provide us the justice that we need. And I think that, too often we get into this idea of we need the Western scientific method to solve the solution. There are many different scientific methods. There are many different definitions of scientist. And so and I truly believe, as you can see by how passionate I'm getting, that is where the solutions are that we're going to find the solutions for climate change in.
Just to answer the first question, I think that there's been some really great developments, just some recent work on weaving multiple knowledge systems into how we address these big challenges, which includes stewardship, agency, care, and also kind of how intersectionality is coming also into and the sort of fusing of social and natural science. A lot of the kind of latest work, for example, the planetary boundaries started out as a very biogeophysical articulation, but there's now released the Earth system boundaries, which is about a safe and just transition, and there's a lot of co-creation processes. We've launched a big program in Sweden on the fair climate transition, which brings together kind of union leaders and companies and communities and different people to work out what that actually looks like. How does that actually play out on the ground? So I think there's some encouraging developments there. As for the second question, you know who I think should go first? Norway. Because that, you know, if there's one country in the world, they have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. They have an immense amount of technical know-how. They're part of a Nordic kind of ecosystem. And I think they could be real leaders in leading the way on what it actually would be to do to take radical decarbonization. So I'm just saying that from my personal perspective. I don't have any, but I really reckon they should start. And if they could start, then they could really set up a model and an alliance and a coalition for a larger group of countries. Maybe they could form an alliance with UAE and work out a path together. I think, but Norway, it would be my simple answer. I hope there's no Norwegians in the room.
I was about to ask, do we have any Norwegians in the room? I know.
No.
So we are almost at time, and I want to end by asking each of the panelists to share what the burning edge of this work is for them at the moment. What's the bleeding edge? What's the bit of your work that you have questions about or feel the most friction around? And who would like to pick that up first?
I'm just going to say that the burning edge of my work isn't my work. It's the work of like 3 of present and former students who I think are doing really exciting things. The first, one who's in the room, is doing work on multi-species futures. Another one is working on post-growth futures in the high seas because she's driven by this real passion that there's all this discourse on post-growth, but how do you actually imagine what that society looks, feels, smells like? How do people live in that? If we want to shift our political economy, then we need to show that alternatives are exciting, dynamic, compelling places to live. And the third one is a woman who's doing her PhD in the Colombian Amazon, working with indigenous women's groups to work out how do you tell hopeful stories in a place that has been wrecked by war, by colonialism, by many things, and working with those groups to really craft using science fiction and storytelling and all of these tools, but working directly with those communities in a really, really exciting way. So so it's just that for me is what excites me, is how the work is being taken forward.
Thank you.
I think for me it's more of a challenge. I've been really struggling with answering this question, but I think for me it's the challenge, and you can see with the things that I'm saying that I think, you know, more voices need to be heard. We need to think outside of our sort of traditional methods, but I also understand that that is necessarily trust-based and relatively slow work. And, you know, as we are often told, we have 7 years left to save the planet. And so, like, how do you balance the fact that, like, you need to slow down and actually hear from people and actually build trust and actually be more relational with, you know, we need to do things now. And so, you know, a lot of my work and a lot of my sort of what keeps me up at night is thinking about that sort of balance and you know, creating these frameworks, tearing down the systems and the isms that are driving our crises today is work that needs to be done urgently, but it's also, you know, necessarily has to be slow and necessarily has to be about building relationships and trust. Move at the speed of trust, not at the speed of business. And I don't know if I know how to balance that sheet yet.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I don't think mine is any different. In fact, I think that the title of our strategy is Making Nature Everyone's Business. And I think in the end, it's about how do you inspire and mobilize others towards the work that you are doing. And mobilize them in such a way that they see value in what you're doing, that they they want to be part of it, that because they know they like it. Because a lot of times we do this, we have a lot of top down, you know. This is important, climate, the world is ending, blah, blah. But I think being able to listen, and as you're saying, slow down in order to go fast is very similar to what you're saying. Being able to take the time to say, let me take time, build trust, understand these people, it's very important. And I think that most of the time, we don't take that time. We don't take that time because we're all busy trying to say, you know, the world is ending. But until we do that, I don't think we're going to get there. So very much in line with what the three said. Thank you.
Great. Well, we could go on, but our time is up. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists for such an enriching conversation, and to thank yourselves for being an awesome audience with really hard questions. So thank you.
And it's so also, I think, like how the nature of the work has changed.